Bene. Good morning, my relatives. It is Friday, December 22, and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I want to revisit a conversation I started last October, soon after the war between Israel and Hamas broke out in Gaza. And it's actually been one of my most popular second cups of coffee this year. I'll share the link with that in a little bit, but I wanted to come back and both answer a few questions that have been posed to me, but also just go in depth a little bit more about that conflict and some of the paradigm shift that I've had as I've been thinking about this, not just in the past few weeks, but really over the past several decades as I've been doing the work that I do. So anyway, but before I begin, let me do like I always do and acknowledge I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C. And these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands and just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So a few weeks ago, I talked about the war in Israel and the war between Hamas and Israel. And actually, there's a third participant, which is the United States of America. Um, and I framed that around the question of the God of Abraham. And I did a fairly in-depth analysis that's coming from the book I'm currently writing called Decolonizing Faith, where I looked at kind of the trajectory of the God of Abraham, or just the aspects of the divine in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I shared some of those thoughts, and I applied them and used them as a framework to look at what's going on in Israel right now, in Gaza, between Israel and Hamas and the United States, and offered that as a perspective on the war. And I got a lot of really good questions, as I do anytime I teach about these things, because I find that most Western people, especially Western Christians, don't think critically about what they're being told in the Bible. And so part of my journey in writing the book I'm writing, Decolonizing Faith, is I'm looking very critically at what's being written in the Bible and in the scriptures and trying to understand what is it actually saying and how does that form our worldview. And so I'll go into that in a minute. But so one of the first things I wanted to do today is just talk for a few minutes about my book, Decolonizing Faith, and tell you a little bit about that book, what the goal of that book is, and what I'm hoping to do with it even in the next few months and years. So before I go into that, let me look and see who's online here, who's joining me. George, hey, thank you for joining today. It's great to see you. I know there's several other people online right now, so I appreciate everyone who's joining me for a cup of coffee this morning. So the first thing let's just talk about what's currently going on in Israel. If you haven't heard, right now, the war going on between Israel and Gaza, the death toll from that war now exceeds 20,000 people. That is a vast majority of them are Palestinian people living in Gaza. About 1,200 Israeli people were killed when Hamas attacked Israel a few months ago. 240 people were taken hostage. Israeli people were taken hostage. And about 130 or a little over 100 Israeli soldiers have died in the war. But the vast majority of the people who have died have been civilians in Gaza, Palestinian people living in Gaza. And so I share that article right there about the death toll now exceeding 20,000 people. I also want to share another story that came out, and this I think started breaking in the past few days. But there was a report by the United Nations that says about a quarter, over 500,000 people in Gaza are literally in a state of starvation right now. And it's only going to get worse as the war continues and humanitarian aid is being blocked from going into Gaza, or at least really limited the amount of aid that's getting in there. And there is a absolute crisis of hunger, starvation, and famine going on in Gaza. as nearly a majority of the population has been displaced. They're finding no place to find refuge, and they are being bombed almost everywhere that they go. Just to highlight some of the article that I wrote, or that I shared with you, it says that more than 500,000 people in Gaza, a quarter of the population, are starving, according to a report Thursday by the United Nations and other agencies. And as this has been going on, so this has happened right now, there's obviously been a lot of movement by the United Nations and the Security Council to put a ceasefire in place and to get more aid into Gaza. And those measures have largely been blocked by the United States. And we have refused to support any sort of ceasefire right now, not any sort, but support the resolutions for a ceasefire, because that's limiting Israel's military options. And we are the nation that is standing in front of there being a resolution by the United Nations Security Council to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. And so this is why I said earlier, this war is not just about Israel-Hamas in the Middle East. This is about Israel-Hamas in the United States. We are funding this war with our money. We are blocking the availability of aid to Palestinian people. We are very much an active, not only participant, but I would say aggressor in this conflict that's going on right now in the Middle East. And so we have to understand that. I also want to share with you just the YouTube video that I put up about a month and a half ago. This was in October, regarding an Indigenous perspective on that conflict. And this is what I'm kind of going a bit more deeper into discussion today. But I just want to go over some numbers with you. And I want to talk about why the United States is such an active participant in this conflict. And if you've heard me lecture before, you've heard me say these things, but I'm going to repeat them here just so we have them in the top of our mind. Obviously, I do a lot of work on the doctrine of discovery. I've written a book, co-authored a book called Unsettling Truths, the Ongoing Dehumanizing Legacy of the Doctrine of Discovery. I use that doctrine to critique the actions of the United States, especially our belief in the mythology of manifest destiny, and the notion that white Europeans have some sort of land covenant with the God of Abraham, which gives them right to rule these lands, Turtle Island, from sea to shining sea. This is what went on to justify not only the enslavement of African people, but the literal ethnic cleansing and genocide of Native peoples. This is what we've done as a nation because of this belief we have in not only the myth of our own exceptionalism, but the lie of white supremacy and the belief that we are God's chosen people and we have promised lands. And as an example of how deep this notion goes, this understanding goes, I use often in my lectures an example of a speech given in our U.S. Congress in 2015. If you remember, this was back when President Obama was president, and he was negotiating a deal. It wasn't even a treaty; it was a nuclear deal with Iran, to try and limit their ability to test nuclear weapons. And as he was negotiating that, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now again the Prime Minister of Israel, was running for re-election. And he was very opposed to what the Obama administration was negotiating. And so, against all precedent, he was invited by the Speaker of the House to give literally a campaign speech to the joint session of Congress. Now, that Congress back in 2015, just like Congress today, was completely divided, very, very partisan. Sides of it weren't even talking to each other. And Benjamin Netanyahu had to appeal to the common denominator, the fundamental values of America, to get people from both the left and the right to support his agenda. And so in his speech, right, this is when he's speaking, this is on March 3rd of 2015, speaking to a joint session of Congress. This is what he said. He said, because America and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. Now, again, promised lands is literally, right? When you look at the Old Testament understanding of promised lands, when God, the God of the Bible, gave Canaan to the people of Israel, the command in Deuteronomy was literally for them to kill everybody who lived there. The command said, leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. Kill everyone in Canaan. Right? Stephen Newcomb wrote a book on the Doctrine of Discovery called Pagans in the Promised Land. Obviously, just using the understanding of what happens when you're a pagan living in a nation's quote unquote promised lands. You get ethnically cleansed, you get destroyed, you get obliterated. And so this is why this notion of we're God's chosen people and we have promised lands is so incredibly dangerous. And so Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was appealing to our Congress, he used the language of promised lands. The United States and Israel, we share a common destiny, the destiny of promised lands. You see, the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel have a very, very, very dysfunctional and codependent relationship. It has almost nothing to do with freedom or equality. Right? We need Old Testament, we need the modern nation state of Israel's Old Testament legacy of promised lands to justify what we've done as a nation to African people and to Native peoples. And the modern nation state of Israel needs our flourishing as a nation with a manifest destiny to justify what they've been doing for decades now to Palestinians and to Bedouins. The relationship between the United States of America and the modern nation state of Israel is incredibly dysfunctional and very codependent. Has almost nothing to do with human rights or equality. It's about justifying violence, nationalistic violence against those you see as your opponents or even your enemies. And in the case of the United States, we've used it even to justify enslavement and genocide. And so we have to understand that this is a shared belief of both the United States and Israel. This is how Benjamin Netanyahu got bipartisan support and applause from both sides of Congress. This mythology, this heresy runs incredibly deep in our nation's understanding of who we are. And this is what we do with that, right? I've already talked about how we've used that understanding that we're God's chosen people and we have promised lands. We've used that to justify our history of enslavement. We've used that to justify our history of ethnic cleansing and genocide. After the terrorist attack of 9/11 on our country, an attack which killed 2,977 victims, we went on a 2-decade war around the globe. Now, there was an article written a few months ago in the Washington Post, which I'm going to share with you. There's also been a lot of studies by the Watson Institute, International and Public Affairs at Brown University that I'm going to share with you. But I want to just give you some stats. So in this war that we were fighting for nearly 20 years after 9/11, about 7,000, a little more than 7,000 U.S. soldiers have been killed. About 8,000, a little more than 8,000 U.S. contractors, most of them not U.S. citizens, but locals from the nations where we're fighting our wars. Over 8,000 U.S. contractors have been killed. There have been over 30,000 suicides of U.S. service members. So looking at that, that's 7,000, that's 15,000, that's 45,000 on the U.S. side, plus 3,000, we'll go up to 48,000 deaths. And again, most of the contractors are not U.S. citizens. Meanwhile, local uniformed deaths in the nations where we're fighting, this is in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Syria, have had 177,000 uniformed deaths. And the estimate of civilian deaths as a result of this war was 387,000 civilians. So yes, it was an absolute tragedy and injustice that there was a terrorist attack on 9/11 in the United States and that 3,000 people lost their lives. But our response resulted in the death of almost 400,000 civilians and nearly another 200,000 soldiers fighting on our side. This is absolutely right. This is what we do. This data came from, I'm going to share some of this data with you right now, where it's at. So this is from Brown University, the Watson International and Public Affairs Institute at Brown University. And this article, the first one gives you the cost of war. The second one is also from the same place, and it's the cost of war, the human cost of post 9/11 wars, direct war deaths in the major war zones. And this is the data that's coming from there. I'm going to show you a graphic from the second article I just shared with you. This is a PDF. And this just gives you, again, this is the number of deaths. So U.S. military service member deaths, 7,052. U.S. DoD civilian deaths, 21. U.S. contractors, 8,189. National military and police, these are other nations. This one says 204 to 207,000. Other allied troops, 14,000. Civilians, 363,000 to 387,000. Opposition fighters, again, over 300,000 people. This is a total cost of 897,000 deaths. Right? This is what we did after 9/11. And so it's no surprise that when one of our closest allies is attacked in much the same way, they feel absolutely justified to respond the exact same way we did, which is to extract a death toll that far exceeds what was extracted from them. I want to just share with you this article from the Washington Post. This was written in May of 2023. And in this article, it says the entire human cost of our war after 9/11. This includes not just civilians who died and soldiers who lost their lives and U.S. other soldiers who committed suicide. This includes people who died because of trash dumps that were built near their houses by U.S. service depots. This is due to the migration and the forced movement of peoples. The entire number of deaths that resulted from our military response to 9/11. And that number, which has been reported as unquantifiable, is at 4.5 million. 4.5 million people died. This is the tragedy of what happens when a nation believes it has been chosen by God and is justified to use nationalistic violence in retribution against its enemies. This is what happens. In the article I just shared from the Washington Post, I'm going to read just this segment of it. It says, since 2010, a team of 50 scholars, legal experts, human rights practitioners, and physicians participating in the Cost of War project have kept their own calculations. According to their latest assessment, more than 906,000 people, including 387,000 civilians, died directly from the post 9/11 wars. Another 38 million people have been displaced or made refugees. The U.S. federal government, meanwhile, has spent over $8 trillion on these wars. This is what we do. And so this is why, right? This is why we have no problem as a nation standing against the rest of the world, saying, no, Israel has a right to their military defense and they can kill as many people as they want, because this is what we do as a nation. This is what is the fruit when you have a belief in your own manifest destiny and you state that you are God's chosen people and you have promised lands. This is what happens. And I'm not even talking hypothetically. This is literally what the United States has done throughout its entire history, and this is absolutely what the nation of Israel is doing right now. Absolutely, the attack by Hamas on Israel was unjust. It's interesting that we call what Hamas did terrorism, and we call what we did a just war. Right? It's interesting that we use that kind of language. And we might actually say that's primarily due to the power differential between these governments, right? Hamas absolutely attacked Israel and killed 1,200 plus people. But that wasn't called war, that was called terrorism. And when Israel responds and tries to take out Hamas and bombs hospitals and churches and civilians and kills more than 20,000 people, that's not called terrorism. That's called war, just war even. Right? When 38 million people are displaced around the globe because the United States got attacked on 9/11, that's not called terrorism. That's called a just response to terrorism. But I can promise you, the people living in Gaza, the people living in Pakistan and Afghanistan and all these other places where we bomb the crap out of these nations, I can promise you those people feel terrorized by us. So this is the challenge, is we don't have a leg of integrity to stand on to call Israel to do anything, because what we've done is far greater than what they were even doing right now. They're just mimicking what we do. That's all they're doing. They're just mimicking what we as a nation do around the globe whenever we feel threatened. So what does this have to do with my book on decolonizing faith? Well, I want to talk about that for a little bit. I want to go into that in depth a little bit. In the book I wrote previously with my good friend Sung-Chan Rao on Selling Truth, in this book, we looked at the way that the scriptures were misused, misappropriated to justify things like manifest destiny and enslavement and ethnic cleansing and genocide. We absolutely called out the United States of America, European nations, and even Israel for what they've done in the past few centuries. Say, yes, you cannot use these teachings to justify nationalistic violence. We absolutely critique that. But we didn't critique the command in Deuteronomy where God told the nation of Israel in the Bible to ethnically cleanse and commit genocide in Canaan. We didn't critique that. This second book, this new book I'm writing on decolonizing faith, is absolutely making that critique. In this book that I'm currently writing right now, I am looking at the faith that my family on my Navajo side was given, and my grandparents were Christians. They worked for the missionaries for most of their lives, even helping translate the Bible into our Navajo language. But they were converted and exposed to Christianity in the boarding schools. And in the boarding schools, we were told as Native peoples that who we understand and knew God to be was pagan and evil, that our creation stories and our beliefs were wrong and evil. We had to stop our savage ways, and we had to become civilized and begin to act like, eat like, dress like, cut our hair like, behave like, worship like, and eat like European people. That's what we were told. And my grandparents accepted that. They became Christians. And again, they worked for almost their entire lives under the auspices, under the authority of Christian missionaries. This was the faith that was given to my father, and this was the faith that was passed down to me. My mother, on the other hand, my mother's white, American of Dutch heritage. She was raised in the Christian Reformed Church. The Christian Reformed Church, the CRCNA, the Christian Reformed Church of North America, ran a boarding school on the Navajo Nation. So they weren't teaching anything different than what my grandparents were already taught. And they absolutely believed in the myth of their own exceptionalism. They absolutely embraced the doctrine of discovery. They named their mission Rehoboth, which means God has given us room. We shall flourish in the land. God didn't give them that land. Abraham Lincoln ethnically cleansed it when he enacted the Long Walk and created a death camp where he marched 10,000 Navajo people down to, killing a quarter of us as we were imprisoned there. God didn't give the CRC that space. Their nation stole it and ethnically cleansed it. And that's the world I grew up in. That's the faith I was given. Right? I became a Christian. I don't even know how old I was. I was very young. And I spent the majority of my life not just accepting these beliefs, but studying the Bible and trying to understand them and trying to understand what it meant to be a native and to follow Jesus and to be a Christian. But over the past few years, as I've begun to look more closely at my faith, and as I began to see the fruits of some of the work I had been doing. So one of the things I started embracing, this was almost 20 years ago, when I was really wrestling with what does it mean to be Native and be a Christian? How does my culture, my traditions, my understanding from my Navajo people impact the way that I approach the God of the Bible and even Jesus? And 20 years ago, when my family, my wife and our son and I moved from Denver, Colorado, where I was pastoring a church called the Christian Indian Center, and we moved back to the Navajo Nation, we lived in a hogan, single room dwelling, dirt floor, log walls, 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road, no running water, no electricity. Our neighbors wove rugs and herded sheep for a living. We lived there for 3 years. We lived on the reservation for a total of 11. And when we moved there, I decided to do something that my people have been doing for hundreds, probably even thousands of years, which is I began rising every morning, walking out of my hogan towards the east and watching the sunrise. And I would greet the sunrise with my prayers. I wrote about that experience in the introduction to this book. I said it right. It's one thing to see the sunrise once a year on a Easter morning service, sunrise service, or when you're going to an early flight, right? It's always beautiful and causes you to pause for a few moments. But when you rise day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, and now decade after decade, and you're in a stance of prayer while you watch the sun come up, it has an unbelievable impact on you. And through that process, I began to know and understand and even commune with Creator in a way that was completely outside of what was defined in the Bible. I began to see and learn things about Creator and about who I was as a person that wasn't tied directly to what I read in the Bible. And I found that by doing that, I was able to very easily commune and approach and even worship Creator and enjoy the beauty of the creation that we had been placed in, and strive to live more harmoniously and walk in better beauty within this creation that had been provided for us. And then after my campaign, this was in 2020, and I was wrestling with God, and I was once again dedicating myself to regularly watch the sunrise. I would go out in the morning, I would watch the sunrise, and I would have a beautiful time worshiping and celebrating Creator. And then I would walk up the river by the Potomac and I would pray. And within 5 minutes, I found myself literally screaming at God. And I was trying to understand why. Why do I have this one moment where I'm in this incredible sense of communion with Creator, and the next moment I'm screaming at God? Where are you, God? Why are you not working to correct the injustices in the world around me? What's going on? Where are you? And as I experienced that for weeks, even months, I realized I was communing with Creator, and I was screaming at the God of Abraham. That's what I realized. I was screaming at the God of Abraham, but I was communing with Creator. Because the God of Abraham wasn't doing for my people what that God was told to have done for the people of Israel. Wasn't protecting us, wasn't working for justice for us, wasn't advocating on our behalf. So I began to examine that a little bit more. And I'll skip several months of journey here, but I began to look at how the Bible introduces us to Creator. A year ago, and I've mentioned this before, but a year ago I was at a conference I attend every year. It's called the Worship Symposium by the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship at Calvin University and Calvin Seminary. I go there. I've gone there every year for almost the past 15 years, probably. And this past year, a good friend of mine, his name is Raymond Miniacon. He's Aboriginal from Australia. And he was there speaking. I wasn't even invited. I wasn't speaking last year. I just went to hear my friend speak. He was visiting the US and he was invited to speak at this conference. And he talked about the history of his people, Aboriginal people, with their Western colonizers and with the church. And the history is very similar to the history here in the US with Indigenous peoples. And he laid out that history very, very well. And at the end of his presentation, he took some questions, and he was asked the question, which most of us get asked whenever we talk about the history, which is, why are you a Christian? The church did horrific things to you and your people. Why do you hold on to this faith tradition? And right, I always talk about, well, my grandparents became Christian. They worked for the missionaries. They translated the Bible. They shared the faith with the family, and we embraced it as a family. And right, I talk about how the faith was redeemed despite what the church had done. And right, that was my answer. And his response was, he said, I'm a Christian because that's who colonized us. He said, if we were colonized by Muslims, I'd be a Muslim. If we were colonized by Hindus, I'd be a Hindu. If we were colonized by Buddhists, I'd be a Buddhist. Right? When someone has a gun to your head and says convert, that's what you do. You convert. He said, but today, as an adult Aboriginal man, I am interrogating my faith to find out if this faith embraces my entire humanity as an Aboriginal man. And his honesty and bluntness floored me. And I asked him later, I said, why did you use the word interrogate? Why not use the word examine or investigate? He said, because those words are too passive. He said, I'm putting my faith onto trial to find out if it accepts me as a full human. And his answer floored me, and I realized that's what I was doing in writing Unsettling Truths, and even in my current book, Decolonizing Faith, I was doing that exact same work. Now, as I was going through my scriptures, and again, I'm now in the process of, I'm no longer critiquing how was the Bible misused to justify violence. I'm saying, how do the scriptures themselves lend to a violent, even colonial worldview? And I began reading the Bible like I wished my grandparents would have been able to read it when they were first exposed to it in the boarding school, which is to have full confidence in who they were as Navajo people, to not be in a state of fear and in danger for their lives and taken from their homes and put into these military-style boarding schools under the threat of punishment and even beatings and rape, which was what happened frequently in these boarding schools. And I wish they would have been able to respond to what the missionaries told them. And so I decided I'm going to read the Bible that way. And then I am going to respond to what this book says about who God is and how this book defines God. And so in the book of Genesis, right, you have the story of Creator. Now, it's different from the Navajo creation story, but I understand a creation story. It's not a science textbook. It helps us understand how to relate to God and how to relate to the environment we live in. And so I understood this creation story as coming from the Middle East. It names the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, portrays God as being very benevolent and caring, creating all of the world, the universe, and putting people in charge of a lot of it. And then when people disobey and they behave badly, God punishes them, right? Adam and Eve sin and God punishes them. But like any loving parent, Creator still provides for them. Yes, God punishes Adam and Eve, kicks them out of the garden, but gives them clothes, right? This is what a creator does. This is what a good parent does. Yes, you discipline your children, but you still love them. You still care for them. You still provide for them. And so he punished Adam and Eve, threw them out of the garden, kicked them out of the garden, but he still made clothes for them to protect them in the harsher environment they would experience outside the garden boundaries. Their children, Cain and Abel, their two sons, right, have a dispute, and one brother kills the other. And again, God punishes, removes him from the context, but also provides and puts a mark on him so that he will not be harmed by other people as he goes even further out into the world. Again, this is what I would expect a creator to do. And then we have the story of Noah. And in the story of Noah, I see an aspect of creator that I don't identify to as a Navajo man, which is creator sees the violence and the sin of creation, and creator says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody, and decides to wipe out all of creation with a flood, except for Noah and his family. And that's an aspect of character I don't relate to as a Navajo man. Like, that's not what a creator does. Later in Genesis, we're introduced to Abraham. Abraham, right, loves God, follows God, is told to leave his family and go to another place. Abraham goes. After Abraham has a son, God wants to test Abraham. And he tells Abraham, are you willing to kill your son out of allegiance to me? And Abraham demonstrates, proves that he is willing to kill his own child out of allegiance to God. I don't see that understanding of creator in my tradition. And thereafter, God now becomes the God of Abraham. Again, this God at Sodom and Gomorrah, again, sees the sin in Sodom and Gomorrah and says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. Abraham tries to talk him out of it, but isn't able to do it. And Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed. After the people are in Egypt, and now after Abraham's, a few generations after Abraham, God is now identifying as the God of Israel. And Israel is enslaved in Egypt. And God is leading them out of Egypt. And God is on top of Mount Sinai with Abraham, giving Abraham the 10 Commandments. And the people are getting impatient and they decide to worship a golden calf. They make a golden calf, erect it, and say, this is who saved us. And they start worshiping it. And God sees that. And God says to Moses, depart from me, for my people are worshiping a false god, and I'm going to destroy them. And Abraham again pleads on behalf of the people, but he doesn't plead based on the value of creation. In his plea, he doesn't appeal to the value of what Creator made. He appeals to God's ego and says, if you destroy the people who the world saw you bring out of Egypt with a heavy hand, they're going to assume it was with evil intent you did it just to strike them down in the desert. So it says God repented and did not bring upon the destruction of Israel as he had intended. But again, God was willing and about ready to destroy everybody. And then we have, right, when the people of Israel get to Canaan. And now, after all of these threats of violence where God both does and threatens to destroy people by God's own hand, now God says to Joshua and to the people of Israel, now I want you to kill everybody. You go in. Leave no man, no woman, no child, no animal left alive. And Israel does that. Goes in and destroys everybody. In fact, the sin of Israel is that they didn't kill everyone. They actually left a few nations intact. But they tried hard to kill everybody. And so you have this picture of the divine in the Bible, which starts as creator, and then it gives a characteristic to creator that doesn't make any sense, which creator wants to kill everybody. And then that creator becomes known as the God of Abraham. And then the God of Abraham wants to know if his followers are willing to kill their own children, and also destroys all of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then that God becomes known as the God of Israel. And the God of Israel is willing to destroy even that God's own people. And then that God goes on to now commission his people and to ask them to destroy all the other nations of Canaan on his behalf. And it's like, and then outside the Torah, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, the people of Israel decide they're being led by prophets, and they say, we don't want prophets or judges anymore to lead us. We want to have a king. And Samuel, who is the prophet in Israel at that point, he laments to God and says, they're rejecting me as their prophet. And God says, no, they're not rejecting you as a prophet. They're rejecting me as their king. And so there's like the conclusion of it, right? So we have creator, God of Abraham, God of Israel, and then king. And as you move further, as the identity of creator moves further away from creator and closer to the identity as king, you see this growing cycle of this divine figure both calling for, condoning, enacting, and ultimately commissioning nationalistic violence against the enemies of this God and that God's people. So much that the greatest king of Israel, King David, someone called a man after God's own heart, was known for how utterly destructive he was in killing tens of thousands of people. Wasn't even allowed to build a temple, because a man after God's own heart, because he had so much blood on his hands. And he's considered the greatest king in all of Israel. Right? When you read the Psalms, the psalmist frequently cries out for God to do what? Destroy his enemies. And then praises God for doing what? Destroying their enemies. If you go back to the story of Noah, right, where God again says, screw it, I'm going to kill everybody. And then at the end of all of that, puts a rainbow in the sky, and the rainbow is a symbol that God will no longer do what? Destroy the world with a flood again. So again, the example I use, let's pretend, right, an abusive father goes in and just beats the tar out of someone with a bat. Just beats them silly with a bat. As they're leaving the room, they put a beautiful picture over the door and say, this is to remind me never to beat you with a bat again. It's like, that's not very comforting, because the problem's not the bat, right? The problem is your violent, vindictive, destructive behavior. That's the problem. So what you see in the Old Testament is you see this understanding of the divine moving further from creator, closer to king, where violence becomes a regular expression of love. And the only people who view violence as love are people who have been abused and people who have been groomed. And the God of Abraham is the God of three religions. Abraham is seen as a founding father in 3 world religions: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. In Gaza, in Israel right now, we have a war between 3 nations. 3 nations which have nationalized their religions and use them to justify violence. The United States with Christianity, Israel with Judaism, and Hamas with Islam. And so we're spending all this time talking about how different these people are and the ways that they're in conflict with each other. And it's like, I think the problem is they all have a very similar belief. They all believe they're God's chosen people. They all accept this narrative of the God as defined by the Torah, moving from creator to king, becoming increasingly violent. And they've all used that narrative and that worldview to justify unthinkable violence against one another and their purported enemies. We don't have to talk about how these nations are different. We have to talk about how they are the same. And no one's having that conversation. No one is looking all 3 of these nations in the eye and saying, what in the world are you doing? Get over yourself. You are not God's chosen people. You do not have the right to enact violence against anyone based on your faith and your divine position with the Almighty. I would argue all 3 of these religions have lost, at least as they've been nationalized, they've lost their understanding of who Creator is. And they've formed God into their own image and now use their God to justify untold violence against their enemies. One of the questions I get about this is, Mark, what does this do to your faith? Right? I'm a Christian. I've been a Christian for 50 years, 52 years of my life. And I tell people, I'm like, you know what? I actually don't know. And one of the reasons I'm writing this book is I'm trying to figure out, what do I do with all of this? See, I was raised to be afraid of God. And I was raised to not ask certain questions. That's how I was raised. That's how the majority of Christians are raised. To be afraid of God and to not ask certain questions. And after 20 years of following the practices of my Navajo people and consistently watching the sunrise in the morning and greeting it with my prayers, I have come to know Creator outside of what was written in the Bible. And I have begun to trust who I know Creator to be through that practice, where I'm no longer afraid to ask these questions. I'm no longer afraid to see where this journey takes me. I don't want my relationship to God, my relationship with Creator, to be defined as someone who's been abused. And when all three of these religions, right, paint this violent, vindictive picture of God, they are grooming people, whether they're at the extreme or just at the center, right? By what they say and don't say, by the questions they ask and they don't ask, by the things that they highlight and don't highlight. Yes, people on the extremes are doing this very quickly, but even people in the center are doing it more mildly. And no one's asking, is this who we really think God to be? Do we even want a God who's defined this way? Do we want a God? Do we want to have a relationship with a God where violence is defined as love? I don't. And for the first time in my life, I have the courage to critique the book that has been telling me that God's love is violent. And so, yeah, I think we need to look very closely at what the United States of America, the modern nation state of Israel, and Hamas are doing with their religions. And we have to look all three of them in the face and say, you have a very broken understanding. And the problem is you're all the same. You all accept the Torah as your scriptures. You all embrace this narrative of God moving from creator to king and enacting and calling for and commissioning and requesting violence on that God's behalf. All three of you do this. And as a result, all three of you are wreaking untold havoc on the world. So these are some of the things I've been pondering and thinking about. And this is my platform to speak. So this is where I'm sharing these things. And I'm in the process of writing this book, Decolonizing Faith. I'm hoping to have it finished, written by sometime in 2024. My goal is by summer of 2024. I'd love to see it published in the early months of 2025. I have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of things I'm trying to get done, but I am so eager to engage this sort of dialogue. And I will say, in the midst of this, I haven't lost my faith. I'm absolutely decolonizing it. But I'm actually very excited about where it may end up taking me. Because the more I can have a faith that doesn't define my relationship to God as violent and fearful, I think that gives me a much better chance of bringing peace and harmony and beauty as I walk on the earth, which I think should be all of our goals. Thank you, my relatives. I appreciate you joining me for this discussion today. If you have questions or feedback you want to give to me, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to try to engage in this. If you want to follow my work, I'm engaging this most in depth on my Patreon site. Patreon is one of the best ways to support my work. Patreon, I've chosen very, very intentionally not to monetize my social media because I don't want advertisers to have any influence over what I do and do not say. And so if I accept money that comes from advertisers, it gives them a little bit of influence over what I do and do not say. So I've decided instead to support my work by creating a Patreon. And I have several tiers on Patreon. I have an Ask Questions tier. I have a Supporters tier. I have a Join the Conversation tier. And I have a Decolonizing Faith tier. In the Decolonizing Faith tier, once a month, I have a video. I post a video and I do some Q&A regarding content as I'm working on this book. I'm an extrovert. I can't just sit down and write and think through these things on my own. I have to be out talking and engaging with them. And so I'm using my Patreon as a way to engage that dialogue. And so if you want to support my work, if you want to be a part of the conversation as I'm actually writing this book right now, I invite you to join my Patreon. And to you can join the highest level is the Decolonizing Faith level. It's $35 a month, but at the supporters level, it's $5. The Ask Questions tier, it's $10. And the Join the Conversation is $20. But they're all great ways that you can go deeper into dialogue with me, to hear more of the content I'm producing, and to help support the work so that I can be as truthful and as honest as I can without undue pressure or influence from advertisers or the rest of corporate America or other institutions. So that's one great way that you can support me and join my work in what I'm doing. Another thing is you can purchase signed copies of my book. On my website at wirelesshogan.com, you can buy a single copy signed by me, or you can buy a 10-pack of books signed by me. If you do a book study special and order the 10 pack of books, I will not only send you 10 copies of the book signed by me, but also give your study at any point over the next year a 45-minute virtual Q&A, where we can get online and talk for 45 minutes or even a little bit longer, questions about the book and dialogue that you have coming out of the study of the book. So anyway, my relatives, I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope your cup of coffee is as good as mine. Walk in beauty, my relatives, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Shahat and Hakonet.